You know what time it is. Another episode of Unfiltered coming your way right here and right now. This one officially go in the books is episode 257. You can jump on board 24/7, 365 and get on board the Unfiltered Revolution. It's easy. Apple, Spotify, everywhere you get your podcast. You can go to the artist formerly known as Twitter, X if you will, if you use that, at Casey Stern, up into the bio and jump on the YouTube channel. Get all the content, 256 now to 257 episodes deep into the pod. Today, we are Met-centric as we do another top 10 list, and with things looking bleak for 2024 and more into the future, we discuss prospects from the failed to the successes, our top 10 list of young cores of the New York Metropolitans in their history. And who better to do that than to welcome back our good friend, historian for the New York Mets. You can find him on X at Brian Wright 86 because that's his name, and 86 a special year. Brian, appreciate you being back. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great, Casey. How are you?
I'm doing very, very well. I'm looking forward to this because we need some brighter times. We need to think about some happier things considering the status of where the Metropolitans might be, although Edwin Diaz, as we tape this here tonight on a Monday, did strike out the side in spring training. Therefore, the World Series is upon us. We are upon it here, Apple, Spotify, wherever you're listening, YouTube if you're watching, or Twitter or X if you're following there. Because of Bet Online, your number one source for all your sports betting needs, latest odds, lines, and matchup reports, baseball, basketball, boxing, golf, and more. They're the latest and fastest and easiest way to get your wagers, live betting, and favorite casino and card games. They're all available now right from your phone. So get over to the website, use your mobile device, and sign up today. Get in on all the action. Remember to use the promo code BELIEVE, BLEAV, get a 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit. It is Bet Online where the game starts, as I start here. And when we look at a list like this, it is fitting because the Mets, although they have a rich history, they've got a lot more failed prospects than they do successful ones. So we do an ode to that at number 10 because these were parts of top cores, Brian, right? They just did not succeed necessarily. And I looked at the list and some of the names that you put on here, and I try not to gag as I think about all of the posters that people were going to have on their walls of the Fernando Martinez's and the Alex Escobars and Henry Mejias and Mike Pelfrey and Phil Lumber, who did throw a no-no, but it was not for the Mets. Which names stand out to you and give you the most pain when you think about some of these failed prospects we have at number 10?
I think like Fernando Martinez. I feel like he was a Mets prospect forever. And it just felt like it was going on and on that he was supposed to come up and be some sort of savior or something of that sort. And it never materialized, but it felt like it was maybe like 3 years worth of this happening because he was a prospect so young. So that's the one that stands out for me. It was very painful to see Philip Humber pitched that. I think it was a perfect game with the White Sox in Seattle in, I think it was 2002 or 2012. I'm sorry. That was particularly painful because that happened either April or May of 2012. So you had that combined with the fact that at that moment, little did we know it would only be, a few weeks from then that the Mets had not had a no-hitter. So that made it especially painful. But Fernando Martinez is the one for me. When I see that name, I'm just like, my gosh, how long was he a valued, a hailed prospect and then turned into a failed one?
Well, he's certainly, I'm thinking from the Dilson Herreras to the Chris Donalds to the Anderson Hernandezes to the Rafael Monteros, and we could sit here forever because there are so many. And every organization has more failed prospects than they do successful ones, but the Mets lead the league in that. They do, however, have guys who have had a lot of success. And at number 9, you've got a lot of that. It just doesn't necessarily with the franchise. Greg Jeffrey's a guy who's come up on lists that you and I have done before, and Kevin Elster were part of a group during a heyday that came up as young prospects, and Jeffrey certainly surfaced during, the heyday in the heavenly year that's at the end of your X or Twitter name at 86. Although a lot of the success that both he and Elster would have would be with other teams. At the same time, we could start with Kevin Elster. Here's a guy who, obviously we think about shortstops now, and ever since we've had Cal Ripken Jr. and the Derek Jeters and the A-Rods and the Garcia Parra and Miguel Tejada, during all that, it became such an offensive position. But at one time, it was okay to just play defense, and Kevin Elster did a lot of that, even though he didn't hit the baseball very well as a Met.
Yeah, I mean, he was a very good fielder. Had a streak of consecutive. I don't know if it was errorless chances or errorless games or something of that sort, but he had that streak. I think it was like in '89. So he was a great fielder. I think this was during a time when not only were the Mets successful, maybe they weren't, they were, getting all the way in '86, but not getting all the way back. This was time that they were really pumping up prospects more so. They were overvaluing them. And I think that's the case with both Elster and Jeffries here is, yeah, they had success later on. Jeffries, especially with other teams. But it was kind of, they were, propping these players up at more than they probably were worthy of being. So I think Elster's a guy who was just a nice shortstop for the Mets. A good, like I said, a good fielder, not really a bat, but served a purpose, even if it didn't totally pan out, maybe as some people might have expected based on the initial projections.
Yeah, and a lot of these on this list, they just didn't pan out with the Mets necessarily, because when I think about it, number 8, Generation K, there is one in there, and Jason Isringhausen, despite having that great first season, where I remember sitting with at least what they used to call a boom box out at Jones Beach and listening to one of his starts during that season when he went 9-2 as a starter, and all was going to be blissful. He did end up saving 300 games, even though he wasn't really having those successes with the Mets. Many remember him obviously with St. Louis and Oakland, more so than with New York doing those sorts of things. However, Paul Wilson, Bill Pulsipher, Jason Isringhausen, Generation K, early 90s, this is the heartstrings of Met fans who all remember this time period where they were going to save the franchise. It is unfortunate, though, because to be fair, Paul Wilson specifically, who would have these issues with the Mets and then with the Reds, had such issues with his elbow and so many times that he was sitting there under the knife, where I really can't blame him as much. It's not the lack of success. I mean, Bill Pulsipher was more of a successful pitcher for the Long Island Ducks than he was for the New York Mets. But you had the injuries of Wilson. You had Isringhausen, who succeeds elsewhere. How do you put a finger on and look back at Generation K here at number 8?
I mean, we've talked about this before, and I had a Generation. You talked about posters. I had a Generation K poster in my room, in 1995. This was gonna be the core for my youth. And I was and we talked also about this. I was at Jason Isringhausen's first victory, 1995. I think it was July of '95 against the Pirates, and I mean, my dad was with me, and I could have sworn he was acting like this was, the parting of the Red Sea. I mean, it was just like, this is this. You'll remember this forever. You'll never. I mean, he'll probably today he'll tell me that singers are. And I'm like, okay. And it turned out not only was he better with another team, he was better in another role as a closer, and a pretty good one with the Cardinals and the A's. He did come back to the Mets as a reliever, but still best years as a closer with the A's and the Cardinals. Not that I could buy stock, but I bought a lot of Bill Pulsipher stock. I just liked the way he looked as a pitcher, as a left-hander. There was no rhyme or reason to that. And then you're right. I think Paul Wilson, I think all of them, honestly, were victims of overuse too soon. And, we kind of scoff at the way pitchers are coddled these days, but these pitchers probably could have used a little bit of that instead of the overwork too soon manner in which they were utilized in the beginning.
The pitchers and the strength of young pitching that the Mets were going to have, that we're going to build the franchise around, is a story you'll hear. A lot of it successful, a lot of it not on this list. And at number 7, we've got some more of those. We're calling it the 5 aces when you think about the time period with Matt Harvey and Thor, Noah Syndergaard, DeGrom, and Wheeler and Steven Matz. And of course, when you think about Syndergaard and the deal with the Jays, you think about Wheeler and that trade for Beltran at the deadline for a rental. And not all of these were homegrown, but all of them were young prospects and prospect talents for the Mets, because look, they're not all homegrown right now when you think about the way they got Acuna and the way they got Gilbert, for example, in this current core. But when I look at this group, let's take it one by one. Let's start with Matt Harvey. Matt Harvey, for me, it is hard not to think of the Harvey's better chance and the bleeding nose and a guy who looked like he was going to be the next Nolan Ryan. And then the dark night, whether he was in traffic or too busy doing other things, not be able to make it to the games on time, let alone find success with the Mets. ends up turning out to be a nice story, returns home and gets some fanfare after, basically trying to kind of resurrect and hold on and hang to the end of his career. But the Matt Harvey experience really was what people ended up thought, what DeGrom ended up being. People thought Harvey was going to be the one to have those successes. So hard not to look back at the Dark Knight and think about the highs, but also all the lows that came with them, Brian.
Yeah, I think as time goes on, we look back on it. I don't want to say more fondly, but we kind of forgive a little more for the struggles that he dealt with. Not only that, but the injuries he also had to manage, and it kind of puts 2015 and that comeback year into light as well. Not just the year, but the postseason. Kind of not wanting to come out of Game 5 of the World Series. But you're right. 2013 was really and it wasn't even a whole year because that was the year that he had to end. That ended prematurely and led to Tommy John. But yeah, that part of 2013 up to really culminating and starting the All-Star game at Citi Field was really special. I mean, it gave memories of Dwight Gooden, 1984, for those who didn't get to experience it. But yeah, that was, especially the team itself was not particularly good. That was the one thing. Harvey Day was what you look forward to. He was pitching. Okay, I'm going to watch. But yeah, for all those pitchers, I mean, Steven Matz, even, as you said, Noah coming in, Jacob deGrom, what he became, because that was supposed to be Rafael Montero, and it became Jacob deGrom, and he's the reason why this core is looked at in such a better light than maybe it might have otherwise been, is the fact that Jacob deGrom became what he was. And I mean, even Zach Wheeler, knowing what he is now to the Philadelphia Phillies, it's not like he didn't want to stay here. It's just that certain people in the front office didn't want to keep him.
Yeah, it has really become sad to think about Wheeler, because I think Syndergaard, you kind of, you get over the fact that the Thor thing didn't end up becoming a long-term success story for the Mets. I think even the Harvey thing, the Wheeler one, is the one that we keep reliving because we keep watching it now, because he's ended up being the healthiest, really, despite the fact that they were concerned at one point about that, and enough so to earn every penny of all these contracts that now have been piled upon for the Philadelphia Phillies, and the most recent one, certainly, which are well-deserved. The postseason numbers, which are just exquisite. It's kind of difficult sometimes, I think, to even think about the fact. And, for Giant fans who are sitting there now thinking about watching Saquon Barkley in an Eagles jersey, a lot of Met fans are certainly already feeling that feeling watching Zach Wheeler as a member of the Philadelphia Phillies. When you sit there and you look at number 6 and you think about the love for the current group, and we added in, look, people forget Michael Conforto was part of this in addition to Alonso and McNeil and Nimmo, and there was a little bit of overlap. Obviously, Conforto having that first big run during that postseason, hitting 2 home runs in a World Series game. And, when Terry Collins allowed him to ever hit against a lefty playing every day, because we know that was an issue during his Mets career, which became almost a laughing joke. I want to start there. When you think about Conforto, is he a guy that you look at as kind of a Mets bust as a prospect when you think of an early draft pick, and a guy that eventually they don't end up keeping, or were the successes enough, do you think, to not have that bust tag on him as a Met prospect?
Yeah, I mean, I think there were enough. There were plenty of ups and downs. Overall, I look at it as more of a plus than a minus. I think he was a better player than people realize when you look at the numbers. And I mean, I remember I did my all-time team book, and he was on there like not as a starter, but he was there. That speaks to partially because there weren't a lot of left fielders or outfielders in Mets history that sustained enough success to warrant being on the team. But I also think it was deserved because overall, when you kind of look at it in totality, Michael Conforto's career was I think more good than bad, although it could have been a lot better. And I look at the rest of it. I mean, Jeff McNeil, I'm still the jury's still out to me, because he had obviously a great hitting, hitting year in 2022, terrific hitting year. But what happened, kind of regressed last year. How is it going to play out, in the long term? Obviously, Pete Alonso, hopefully that's a long-term situation with the Mets. It needs to be. And then Brandon Nimmo is going to be a center fielder or an outfielder, at least for the foreseeable future. And I think a few years ago, maybe that was in question, whether or not he was going to be kind of a regular player or kind of a cornerstone piece for the Mets. But it seems like that's going to be the case, and hopefully he can sustain the kind of the same success he's shown the last couple of years. But yeah, I mean, this is one of those that is in the middle of our list for a reason, because it could, especially if Pete Alonso stays, this could go much higher. And I think, Michael Conforto will stay with it because you said 2015, but this could has a chance to move up on the list, depending on if Pete Alonso stays and going with that, if he continues to hit a lot of home runs.
Rich, hopefully he'll do both. You mentioned left field, and I was sitting there writing down, just dreaming of the days of we had Todd Hundley in left field, we had Daniel Murphy in left field, and we had the great Roger Cedeno twice in left field. So left field defense has been what it has been over the course of its time. So shout out to my guy Cliff Floyd and among others who have actually had success there. It's interesting on the Nimmo part, because I think that was a surprise for a lot of people. When he got drafted, I don't think there were people who thought, considering where he came from in a section of the country that people are just not watching. And I think a lot of Met fans just, really never thought he would pan out to be the type of player that he's been. Maybe an extra guy. Yeah, okay, it still looks like he's got good on base skills, but I don't think they ever thought that he would turn into anything. He certainly improved himself in center field and has done a terrific job and earned a big contract, and is now a stalwart here with the New York Mets, whether he's playing in center or in left. Speaking of stalwarts, when you think about the mid-'80s and the success that those Met teams had, at number 5, that mid-'80s rotation with Doc and Darling and Sid, and this is not to forget about Bobby Ojeda, but he did not come from that. Here's a guy who came through trade. But when you think about the youth in all of that, and I would even say, look at a smaller end, Rick Aguilera and what he was doing in the bullpen. I mean, there were a lot of young guys who came up in that core, but it's hard not to think about Doc and the success levels he had. And if you think about, if we're going to do an all-time list of all-time prospects that the Mets have had, he's a guy who's deserving of fitting twice on our list, which he does. Mm-hmm. And one of those in this rotation, because that mid-'80s doesn't happen with the Mets and Frank Cashen having their eye on young starters, which ended up being a huge part of that success in the '80s.
Yeah, I mean, Dwight Gooden is kind of kind of the largest piece of this core for obvious reasons. But Ron Darling, we all certainly see him and hear him on a daily basis, but he was a terrific pitcher for a few years in the 85, 86 up until even the late 80s. And then Sid Fernandez, I don't always think about Sid Fernandez, but when I do, I think about if he were pitching today, he'd be an ace, because he was a guy who maybe like in the later innings would kind of lose steam. So today he would be, and also he was a guy who kind of, was able to not allow a lot of hits, didn't allow a lot of contact. So I feel like today in the modern era, he would do great. But unfortunately he was pitching in the day when they expected pitchers to go a little bit longer, and he was not able to do that. But otherwise, really underrated. And then we're not even including, and because we're mid-'80s and not late '80s, David Cohn, who came about later in a trade with the Royals. So in '88, him having a terrific year that year, and then for the rest of his Mets career. So you look at this was kind of a piece of that mid-'80s team that kind of gets, I'm not including Doc in here, but the other two who kind of get overlooked because of all the other leaders on that '86 team. This was a piece that was really important. And we think about like Darling and Sid Fernandez in that '86 World Series and what they did, especially. So Doc is certainly kind of overshadows for a lot of reasons, but there were more pieces to it than just Dwight Gooden.
When you think about at number 4, our love for that just continues. The best infield ever continues to surface in different ways on these lists. And Edgardo Alfonzo and Ray Ordonez, both of those guys. And I think about the Jeff Kent trade and the fact that, people forget that, here was Alfonzo, a guy who was playing third base with Kent at second, then at second baseman. And Edgardo Alfonzo was their best big hit guy during those years. I mean, ironically, even though you get Ventura, who was the Grand Slam single, obviously that we all remember, 2021-01, and Mike Piazza in that big swing, it was Alfonso time and time and time again. And he always seemed to put up the best at bats in that spot, in those spots. He was not your prototypical old school number 2 hitter that was going to bunt guys over, but he'd drive in runs, and more of a kind of now school the last 10 years, what you would find in the 2-hole, and a guy who you could say for a lot of those times was the best run producer on that team when you had those, as Keith would say, ducks on the pond in big spots and runners in scoring position. And for Ray Ordonez, I was thinking about this, when he would make errors, it was weird. It was like on the simple plays, it was like he needed to be like making something dynamic happen to all the time. I mean, he was finding ways to, like an Omar Vizquel, and I mean that as a compliment, to always find extra flair and additional flair into plays, or Robbie Alomar used to do at second base, not the Met version. Don't yell at me, Met fans. But when he was playing for the Orioles and the Indians at the time. But I think about both those two, what they did in the middle of the infield, what they did for that team, and what they ended up becoming, especially Alfonso. And both these guys are belonging here at number 4.
Yeah, and I think Ray Ordonez probably was one of these other prospects who got hyped probably too much. But he was, in terms of the defense, worth the hype. His offense was left a lot to be desired, but I remember that first game, 1996 opening day against the Cardinals, rainy day, but he made this terrific play from his knees on a relay, outfield relay to throw, I think it was Royce Clayton out at home, preserve a 1-run deficit, and the Mets go on to win the game. But that's like that's one of the many highlights Reardon has delivered. And you're right, he seemed to thrive on those spectacular plays rather than the routine plays. But he was worth the hype in terms of the defense. And Edgardo Alfonso, you mentioned it in terms of where he played when he came up in 95. I mean, he was second base, third base, second base, third base. I mean, he went back and forth, found a home at second base, and that was really where he thrived, not only in the field, but also at the plate. I would, for my money, I love Mike Piazza, but Edgardo Alfonso was the most clutch player of that era, because I can think of the 99 playoff run from Cincinnati hitting a home run in that 1-game playoff, to 2 home runs in the first game of the NLDS against the Diamondbacks, the grand slam to cap it off. Big hits, and as you said, big at bats. Like, it wasn't like he needed to have hit a home run or deliver an extra base hit. I mean, he could draw a walk or bunt the guy over, something like that. He was always the guy you were always happy when he came up. But Edgardo Alfonso is one of my favorites. Understated, I think, still understated. I think he's getting his deserved flowers, if you will. But during the time he was playing, it was obviously much more underrated than he should. He should have been rated, or he should have got a lot more praise during his time.
I remember sitting at MikeDup4MLB.com at Roosevelt Field Mall next to a kid who was starting his career and was about to become a fan favorite and an all-timer, and watching him sit there and smile that there was a line of like 100 people at Roosevelt Field Mall who were lining up to get his autograph. And I don't know if at the time David Wright knew what his Met career would become. But for David Wright and Jose Reyes, who had the pleasure of covering, and we all got to watch, and you think about what they became, and you think about 2006 and all of that, and just how great that team was. And obviously we think about 07 and 08 and the collapses and all of that, but those guys were really put those teams in position to be there. And those guys were a huge reason why the team was able to get the Beltrons and make the deals for the Delgados and get the LaDucas, because they saw what the team was building. And it certainly was not because John Maine and Oliver Perez were in the rotation, for crying out loud. So I think for both of these guys, I think about just the electricity and the charisma that they both brought on the field, the smiles that they both brought, that kind of, appointment view that came back at the time to the stadium and then eventually into Citi Field during that move. And you just can't say enough about what these two did at number 3, David Wright and Jose Reyes.
Yeah, kind of like we said about Fernando Martinez, and it seemed like he was a prospect forever. I remember hearing about David Wright and Jose Reyes for so long, and then them kind of moving up the system. I mean, they might have been the first, maybe Ordonez, but they were really the first 2 prospects that I had heard about. Is we obviously prospect tracking was a lot more robust, but I had heard about them. I was tracking them, and kind of when they came up, Reyes in 03, Wright in 04. Was that really a dark time in Mets history? So these are people you were anticipating, highly anticipating them to come up, and both just had their own way about them in terms of electricity and enjoyment for playing the game. And part of me wants to look back at it and go, what could have been, both for both players, not just individually, but collectively, especially like 06, 07, 08. But overall, just kind of what they brought and how the Mets would never have been close without them. I look back at it a lot more fondly. I mean, it's more of just a nostalgic kind of thing. But you have the two, I think to this point, the two most hits in Mets history, David Wright and Jose Reyes. I don't think I'm wrong on that. I'm getting talking off the top of my head. I know David Wright has the most hits, but I believe Jose Reyes has the second most.
Yeah, you think about duos and you think about Wright and Reyes and what they did and what they became. And then I think about as a kid, and the kid in me, when they hear Doc and Darryl, I mean, that's all you kind of need to know. And even though the unfortunate part is what comes with that in some respects, Brian, is what might have been and what could have been, and the unfortunate nature of a lot of what happened off the field. We cannot forget the moments on the field, the electricity, what they did for the franchise, what they were, still bringing a World Series in 1986, what they still are for the franchise now, albeit the fact that we need amnesia selectively with Doc Gooden and what he did with that one fine game that he had with the Yankees in that uniform that he did not have as a Met. But for Doc and Darryl, not much more needs to be said than the fact that they could be one on a number of different lists that we have. They're number two here in terms of the young cores that we've ever seen in the franchise for the New York Mets.
Yeah, and when we look back at the what could have beens, and I think we look back now at Doc and Darryl and think about how young players especially in New York City, are handled. I think we think about them, or we wish it would have been different, because they needed to be taken care of a lot better. And I think that's been explained in a lot of different ways recently. But I think for what they provided, I mean, Darryl Strawberry, this speak to the lack of longevity in terms of Mets history. And this record won't stay for long, but Darryl Strawberry, most home run in Mets history. Hopefully it saying Pete, this is talking about Pete Alonso. Hopefully it doesn't last for long. But that does speak to Darryl Strawberry and what he did provide, from 83 through 1990. And then Dwight Gooden, I mean, 1984 and 1985, I mean, you could not have had a better start to a career, and he was 19 and 20 years old. That's just hard to fathom that someone at that young of an age was performing the way he was. Most strikeouts in the league in 84. And then 1985, to this day, and we've already talked about Jacob deGrom, we're going to talk about another pitcher. To this day, for my money, the best pitching season in Mets history. And that is saying a lot. 1985 was that good. And it's one of the best in Major League history. But for, Dwight Gooden, I think we look back for Gooden and Strawberry, we look back at what they didn't do. It's okay to look back at what they did do, and they did provide a lot, and that included the last World Series, which it's the last one, so it is special, and they deserve their place in the rafters, which will be coming up this year.
The amount of moments, and that's wonderful, and we can't wait for that. But the amount of moments that they brought, and all the joy that they brought, and the fact that the story ends up a good one with how they're back entwined again with the organization, all of that, I think. And that their lives continue, because it certainly looked like it might not go that way with some of the off the field stuff that was going on in both cases. And to see them healthy and to see them thriving and part of the organization is so great to see, both for Doc and for Darryl. When you talk about thriving, obviously, when you think about putting the late in front of Tom Seaver, it's still difficult even to think about. But for Seaver and for Jerry Koosman, I mean, these are guys who they branded the franchise, a franchise that had been branded as a failure, that had been branded as an afterthought, that had been branded as just a disaster. They turned that around. They turned that upside down, and they gave the Mets hope, and they gave them reason, and they gave them success. And really, for that, among all other things, in addition to the successes and the fact that Seaver is the greatest Met to ever play in that uniform, Seaver and Koosman are sitting here at number one.
Yeah, and that's the main reason. It's just because it's, as you put it, they branded the franchise. Tom Seaver's the greatest Met ever, and it's not even a discussion. And it's Jerry Koosman's probably the most, I would say, the most underrated Met ever. Maybe we could talk about, I mean, we've probably done this list, and Carlos Beltran is, Carlos Beltran probably number one. Koosman's up there. I know we definitely discussed him, but I think you take those two factors and John Olerud for sure. Jerry Koosman, I think the best, and then again, we talk about Alfonso and his clutch performance, probably more in my mind than Piazza. You could make a case that Jerry Koosman was a better big game pitcher than Tom Seaver. You know, when you look at the 1969 postseason, you know, game 2 of the World Series after the game 1 loss to the Orioles, he comes through, has I think 7 no-hit innings. I don't think he goes all the way, but Mets win that game and they win the rest of them. And then the rest of them, one of them being the clincher, game 5, going the distance, gave up a few runs early, but didn't give up any after, you know, I think it was like the 3rd inning or something like that. But he, you know, pitched a complete game. And then he had, you know, another big game in the World Series as well. So, you know, the best left-handed pitcher in Mets history. So we talk about how pitching has changed, but still you go back, those were important pieces and they delivered, and they, relative to the pitchers in the league, Seaver and Koosman were like the two best 1-2 probably in the league for a period of, from really 68. Seaver was the rookie year in 67, Koosman almost for the year in 68, but really 68 through 75, 76. I think Koosman won 20 games in 76. There might not have been a better 1-2 during that period. And Jerry Koosman, also another one who rightly deserved his number being retired, and glad that happened a couple years ago. But it really kind of cements their legacy, both Seaver and Koosman. I mean, we talked about Tom Seaver forever, and no need to continue on with that. But kind of, I think the combined forces really cement their legacy at the top of this list for what they did, starting at an early age, because they were only, you know, 69. They were only a couple years into their career, and they, as you said, they established a legacy that continues on.
Where do the Williams and the Acuna and the Gilbert and others end up in this list? Where do you think, kind of project where they would be in your top 10? Let Brian and I know on Twitter or X, if you will, at Brian Wright 86, at Casey Stern. We will continue to look back with the Metropolitans as we move forward along the way, as Unfiltered continues throughout the 24 season. Brian, appreciate this. We'll do it again soon, man. It is always good to have some positivity in a season that may not give us much of that, if we're being quite honest.
I'm happy to provide it, and I'm looking forward to the season. No matter how it turns out, I'm cautiously optimistic for a playoff appearance. But
see, I like that.
Yeah,
I like that. Yes, be optimistic. I need some of that. It balances me out with this force.
I'm here for it.
We continue, and we'll see you next time. Yeah, well, I need it. We'll see you next time on Unfiltered. As always, we are presented by